Greetings and welcome to Sports 101, the show that discusses sport beyond the X's and O's. Here we like to expand our conversation to include the history, past, present, as well as in the making, and we also look at the game from a people, places, and cultural perspective. I'm your host, Jamar Harp. Be sure to follow me on social media at Coach_Harp412 and on Facebook under Jamar Harp. Please get social with Sports 101, the world's only Black-owned sports podcast, and Sports 101 and a litany of other shows on Sports Zone Chicago while following Sports Zone Chicago on social media. Sports Zone Chicago will be found on Twitter at Sports Zone CHI, Facebook at Sports Zone Chicago, and Instagram at Sports Zone Chicago. Remember, Sports Zone Chicago is a world's only, again, Black-owned sports talk app. You can watch and listen to my show, Sean and Maya in the Morning, our flagship show, and so many others. Keep up with your breaking sports news and your favorite teams. If you miss something, don't worry. All you got to do is go to YouTube and search Sports Zone Chicago and subscribe to the channel. Besides that, we need everyone to download the Sports Zone Chicago app. The Sports Zone Chicago app can be found in the iTunes, Google Play, and Amazon stores. Now, I would like to introduce this week's episode, which is based on the HBCU Music and Rugby Festival. Now, this is a great event. I want everyone to highlight this and check this out. Please go on YouTube and look up past events because, again, this is the only festival of its kind that highlights rugby in the African diaspora community. So before you ask, what are we talking about, I'm going to show you something that most people know about this sport, and it's a celebratory or war dance that most people call a haka. So to get us in the rugby spirit, we're going to get a haka from the All Blacks from New Zealand.
And now the All Blacks just waiting for the French to peel off the tracksuits, stand in front of them and receive the challenge of the haka. challenge has been received by the French. Stand by, the Rugby World Cup final.
All right, so ladies and gents, what you just saw right there was a war dance, mostly performed by the Maori people and other Polynesians. It was done in ritualistic times before they went to war, and now it's a symbol of culture and pride that many Polynesians do before sporting events, just things that they find near and dear. And again, that's going to be our introduction to rugby. So when we talk about rugby, and particularly this HBCU Classic, we have to talk about, my brother from back home, Gift Egbelu. Now, oftentimes when we look at HBCU sports, most people want to talk about football, which is also a form of rugby, by the way, originally, basketball, track, and maybe even soccer. But again, we have individuals like Brother Egbelu who have been promoting the sport of rugby to the urban community for growth and leisure and even competitive matches. Now, before we bring on Mr. Egbelu, I want to show you a video that's going to talk about the growth of rugby in this country, in particular in the HBCU realm.
Rugby has long been popular overseas. Now it's getting more of an audience in the U.S. And groups at historically black colleges and universities want to add the game to their schools' lists of official sports. CBS News' Skylar Henry introduces us to a Howard University sophomore who founded her own team.
Several times a week, these young women from Howard University hit the pitch, perfecting their technique and form.
I love the physicality of rugby. I like to go for the ball. I like to be intense, and rugby is a sport that celebrates all that intensity.
Captain and founder Takunda Rusike wants to elevate her intramural team to a sanctioned NCAA program.
And what would that mean? Does that mean more funding?
Pretty much anything that we have, it's like we've gotten from outside sources. Our hopes are as time goes on and we get more rapport that we would be able to use some more university resources. Go!
The 19-year-old's push is backed by groups looking to bolster rugby in and around Washington, D.C., especially among historically black colleges and universities.
There's about 900 rugby clubs at colleges around the USA, and there's only 2 at HBCUs.
Howard alumna Kirill Guthrie now lives in Sri Lanka, contracting with the State Department. She uses her love of rugby as an icebreaker in her travels after years of playing herself. Guthrie created a foundation to get these teams up and running.
Help them pay their registration dues, field fees, referee fees, and any kind of monetary needs that they need, so they don't have to focus on fundraising as well as playing.
With momentum at every turn, recruiting athletes was easy.
I would say right now we have a solid 25 to 30.
And Rusike wants even the littlest athletes to take notice.
I hope that other black little girls who play rugby know that there's a spot for them at Howard.
Their goal is to keep winning, both on the field and off. Skylar Henry, CBS News, Washington.
Thank you so much for tuning in. Again, I'm Jamar Harp, and this is Sports 101, a show that talks about sport beyond the X's and O's. Now, we do see, just like other sports, and most of them, particularly soccer, how we lack representation in the rugby community. But before we get to our special guest tonight, I want to basically show you guys what rugby is. Now, the name comes from a town in England where it was founded. So more or less it's like association football. Again, they call that soccer now, but everything really comes from the same umbrella, including American football. So before we bring our special guest in, I want to show you a quick 3-minute video on basically some fundamentals and some concepts of rugby so you can understand what we're talking about during the presentation.
A brief history of rugby union. Rugby originated out of an early form of football. Not like football as we know it today, but a much cruder form of the game, full of rough and tumble, with no limits to the number of players on each side, and not too much in the way of rules. Players were allowed to catch and kick the ball with their hands, but they weren't allowed to run with it, and that was pretty much it. Legend has it that in 1823, A young lad by the name of William Webb Ellis didn't care too much for this rule either, and so during a game of football at the rugby school in the town of Rugby, Warwickshire, England, caught the ball and ran with it towards the opponent's goal line. The idea caught on, and rugby students spread the game's gospel across England. In fact, the world's first and oldest football club, the Guy's Hospital Football Club, formed in London in 1843, was formed by old boys from rugby school. Soon, a number of other clubs formed to play games based on the rugby school rules. Clubs like the Dublin University Football Club, which, founded in 1854, has arguably become the world's oldest surviving football club in any code, and the Blackheath Rugby Club in London, which was founded in 1858. In fact, it was Francis Moule Campbell, a member of the Blackheath Club, that led the breakaway from the newly formed Football Association in 1863, when it moved a motion to expunge two rules integral to the rugby style of the game at the time, namely running with the ball and hacking, basically kicking an opponent in the shins. Campbell argued that hacking was an essential element of football, and that the rules that the FA intended to adopt would do away with all the courage and pluck required to play the game. He feared that they would destroy the game and all interest in it. In protest, he withdrew the Blackheath Club, and other rugby clubs followed this lead and refused to join the Football Association. Instead, they formed their own association, and on the 26th of January 1871, in a meeting attended by representatives from 21 clubs, they founded the Rugby Football Union. And what of that young boy that legend says started it all way back in 1823? Well, aside from a statue and a plaque at his old school in Rugby, which reads, "This stone commemorates the exploit of William Webb Ellis, who, with a fine disregard for the rules of football as played in his time, first took the ball in his arms and ran with it, thus originating the distinctive feature of the rugby game, AD 1823. The Rugby World Cup trophy just happens to be named after him. The Webb Ellis Cup, colloquially known as Bill, is awarded to the winner of the Rugby World Cup."
Thank you again. Now, that haka we saw opening between the All Blacks of New Zealand and France, that was the final of the Rugby World Cup. So now that we know the origins, let's talk about how the game traveled. During the colonization period, missionaries colonizers under disguise of missionaries brought the game to South Africa, and it spread through the continent that way. If you look at South Africa and their rugby team, the Springboks in particular, when Nelson Mandela first was released and became president, that was a point of contention in the country. Number one, the integration of the Springboks, and would they change their flag, colors, songs, etc. There's movies about that, and actually what he did was he used that team to galvanize the country. So that shows how sport is a sign and symbol of nationalism as well as culture, with nationalism being love and pride for one's country. Now, when we talk about that love and pride, again, our special guest, Gift Egbelu, displays that in his love and passion for soccer. Mr. Egbelu is the founder and director of HBCU Rugby and Music Festival. Please go to this year's event. It's just getting bigger and bigger. He does so many things. So without further ado, I'd like to bring on our special invited guest, Mr. Gift Egbelu, today.
Hey, thank you for having me.
No problem, man. I'm loving it so far. I love your background. I really love you. Appreciate it, Haka. Thank you for being on.
Man, I love seeing that because you always have to figure out how to contextualize what rugby is, and I just love having those videos. And some of that is a little nostalgic for me. Like I remember that watching the 2015 Rugby World Cup, and then well, we didn't get a similar thing in 2019, but it was a reminiscent feeling on the whole thing.
Definitely. So, can you tell our guests in the Sports Zone Chicago family a little bit about yourself, where you're from, where you grew up, etc.?
Yeah, so my family is originally from Nigeria, but I was born in State College, Pennsylvania. I like to call myself a college brat because my dad had us moving around. He worked for the universities, and with each university, we moved to another town. So it brought me all the way down to Louisiana. Ended up going to school out in Florida at University of South Florida, where I was first introduced to rugby physically. I actually knew about it because of football, because my football coaches wanted me to know it, and through a study of understanding American football, I learned that rugby was the progenitor of football. When I went to school, dorm mates, they played rugby, but at the time, I thought rugby was just the archaic sport to football. I didn't think that it was something that people played anymore. It was just like the equivalent of doing a medieval cosplay. You know, it exists, but it's not really a thing.
Like jousting, yeah.
Exactly. But little did I know that after I graduated and returned back home to Baton Rouge, I ended up watching a little TV. I was watching NBC, happened to catch rugby, and what I would end up finding out is the Rugby Sevens tournament, and looked at them and I was like, oh, these guys don't juke. I was like, it'd be funny if Baton Rouge had rugby, because I was pretty sure Baton Rouge wouldn't have any rugby. There's nothing in Baton Rouge. But lo and behold, I learned Baton Rouge not only had rugby, but had rugby for going on 40 years at that point for both the university, LSU, and for the men's club for the city. So I thought maybe, okay, I checked out their website, and I was like, they're probably defunct club, because, you know, there's always dead websites everywhere. This is early 2000. This is 2009. And went out to the practice, as I mentioned, and the guys were out there. So I told them, they were like, hey, you should come play. I hadn't been mentally prepared for it because I thought they weren't going to exist. But the following week afterwards, I started playing, and, you know, history just kind of took on from there. Went from playing and distributed out from that point.
Now, you talked about rugby sevens versus traditional. Can you let our viewer and audience know the difference between rugby seven and the traditional game?
Absolutely. So rugby has a couple different codes. Primarily, whenever you hear the term rugby, it actually is meaning rugby union. And rugby union is often defined by 15 on 15, or what we'll call rugby 15. So 15 people on per side, and you have your split between backs and forwards. Now, rugby sevens is basically a condensed version of that same game. And it's exactly as it says. Rugby sevens, 7 on 7. It is 7-minute halves, 1 minute halftime, played on the same 70-meter by 122-meter field. And so basically it ends up becoming a game that's become a high-speed game, and it's now more popularized because it got adopted back into the Olympics back in 2009 and revealed for the first time since the early 1900s back in 2016. So we've gone through our second rotation of rugby sevens, but rugby 15s is defined as basically your standard version of rugby, which you know, if you're a bigger guy, this is your preferred one. If you love good speed, fast paced, rugby sevens tends to be your attracting one.
Now, you talked about the differences and the dichotomy of union and rugby sevens. Which one do you think would gain more notoriety in this country to kind of push for airplay with the already traditional sports and compete against soccer, which is up and coming?
So it's an interesting, I love that you asked that, because it's kind of interesting. With rugby sevens, I think it's a much easier game for people to grasp onto, but it's a harder game for people to create a specific team loyalty, which, you know, typically when it comes to sports is what we do. We see our players come in and out. And of course, we get to know our players, but we have a condensed version, and we want to see something that isolates the game into it. So when we watch one game, we see 1, 2, 3 things happen and done. But rugby sevens gives you kind of like a teaser of everything. You'll usually see it played in tournament form. Typically, it's going to be at the highest levels, 12 teams per tournament. So you're going to see maybe somewhere around 3 rotations. So you're talking about maybe about 36 games per day. before the playoffs and championship games. And so in that rotation, you're watching the 12 teams play 3 times over within different pools. So I think it gives people a great taste, but it is, like I said, it's a condensed version. Rugby 15, I think, actually has a greater long-term effect where people can actually settle into regional teams. They can actually settle to actually find the stars, and they can see a greater depth. It can come off like a slower, more chaotic game. So it's harder for people when they first do it, but as you settle into it, it makes much more sense. And I think from there is where people can then kind of make it a generational affect.
Now, one of my hesitations with union was I always thought people in this country would associate it more with American football due to the nature of the game. Like you said, it's a start and then stop, and you know, you have to stand over and then throw the ball backwards. It's sort of like the game everybody grew up playing, Fumble Annie, or so many different names for it. And, you know, get that exposure, attraction to move up, especially with the concussions and the violence of union rugby. Do you think that'll ever take the place of American football, or there'll be a paradigm shift?
I honestly, I don't think it'll take the place of American football. And to be honest with you, I don't think it needs to take the place of American football. American football is something that is a cultural lexicon. And, you know, when it comes to, you spoke on it when it came to the development of rugby and just sports in general. Nationalism typically has a higher play than just anything else. But I do think that rugby has a place that can actually rise up into that big four for a few effects. One, I think there's a similarity that people can recognize with American football. I think we're a country that deals with aggression, and we deal with conflict in a way that's very natural to our attitudes here in this country. And so the aspect of rough contact sports is not foreign to us by any means. But I think it's different enough where it doesn't feel like it's an amalgamation of pro football. So, you know, unlike what you'd get from like a USFL or what you got from any other, you know, minor league football, you don't feel like you're getting the worst version of another sport. It's completely different, just similar. I think something to the effect of what one could figure from boxing and UFC. You can find your whereabouts. The other factor of it is, I think, especially here in the States, when it comes to competition, we love competition of country to country competition. Regardless of what our feelings of the country are in any one set in place, but we do love to be able to say we rep some country, and we like to impose that on another sport. We say we got the best athletes in the country, we like to see it. And I think rugby gives an aspect where we can play in a context that we're familiar with aggression, in the field play, within the scoring, but we are able to see what we can do against other people. Right now, we're still growing and developing, but we've come a long way than what we were 20, 30 years ago, and seeing our development grow. But being able to have that international mobility, I think, changes the way also that we would be able to do, because this world's getting smaller, especially with social media. And then the last aspect is, even though rugby is an older sport, it is actually a much more younger developing sport. And in terms of how it deals with economics and marketing and representation, et cetera, like that. So I think there's a lot to be able to develop out from that will grow rugby into that big 4, big 5 range.
Okay. Now, speaking of representation, we know most sports, due to the systemic racism that this country was started off in a more homogenous state where only for Europeans. But right now, we see soccer around the globe is an African sport, even in Europe, except in America. So can we talk about why is rugby so white?
So really easy question. It's really funny because the elements of where rugby come from is based off of amateurism, and it's actual exists. The issue that makes rugby so white right now is the same reason why American football and the popularization of association football, aka soccer, actually exists, because the idea of amateurism came in, and basically at its base they shamed the idea of making money and made it more difficult for people of lower economic states to be able to play consistently. And of course, elite people then subsequently are playing more. The other part of it, and you know, coming out from Europe, this is what generally happens. You congregate within private schools, and that's what happened here in the States. Most of rugby transferred over into parochial schools, aka Catholic schools, etc., like that, and they became more recognized within private schools. But because of the fact that it didn't transfer out, because there wasn't really an upward mobility for rugby, except for to quote quote play for the love of the game, people would not naturally gravitate to that whenever you're putting your body on the line every single week, all the time. It actually created an division in rugby itself, creating what's rugby league, which created its own professional. While it's not as big, but developing. But it had, because of those aspects, you create this insular base of rugby rotation. And only recently that you start to see that rugby is now recognizing, hey, maybe we need to kind of spread outside the range of just what we have, especially in a country like the US that has so many options that maybe to be able to grow, we can develop. What worked in England doesn't work in the US. And just because you had power in New Zealand where there's not as many people doesn't mean that you're going to see the same thing happen in larger contexts. And that's where we have it now. And now we're getting that representation increase.
Great. I swear it's like you throwing me oops this whole time. So you talking about growth. How can we grow this game in diaspora? And this is not planned at all. This is strictly freestyle. Like,
yo, this is what we do.
Yeah.
Look, I think one of the best things that we've been doing is recognizing that, and for me, it's one thing that I love to focus on, is recognizing that rugby isn't just a sport. It's a developing economy in and of itself. It's an ecosystem in its sort. And the more that we've been able to find Black people continue to grow in rugby from a grassroots level, where we had guys from the past, like there's a former predominantly Black traveling team called the Grey Wolves, to today we have a team called Roots Rugby, who attract more and more Black players to play at mid levels, basically at club levels. You have the development of more star players at the international level, guys like Perry Baker, Carlin Isle, Nia Tapper, Chetta Amba. You have these eclectic, just charismatic people who play fast, they play hard, even overseas, in Canada, Charity Williams, or, just France. There's just so many to be able to choose from, but you get to see them more. So it now creates a placement of self that's there. And then, of course, what becomes even the greatest point is developing the youth side. And that's the one that we're working on a lot more heavily now. And you guys have teams and organizations like Washington, D.C. Rugby, Memphis Inner City Rugby, Dallas Youth Rugby, ISEF out in L.A., St. Louis Inner City Rugby, and these at Jacksonville. I don't want to mess any of my guys up, but definitely. All these guys are creating creating roots inside the community, and it continues to grow. And they show that not only is rugby something that's just a sport that you can do that's different than football, soccer, football, track, basketball, but it's a sport that can actually take you out of your area, not just your region, not just your state, but out of the country, and find this amalgamation of people that create this fraternal network. So within the community, we're starting to see those elements become revealed. And now we're trying to bring the culture into rugby, as opposed to just let rugby culture fill itself. But we're bringing that other side that actually puts a foundation of what American culture is as well. And that's how I believe we would grow inside the community most.
Fantastic. Now you talk about that growth. Now, when we look at lacrosse, that's more of a northeastern game, and you have a lot of diaspora or individuals from the continent of Africa that participate in lacrosse, but it's mainly again a northeastern corridor. Do you think that rugby will have a regional growth as well and carve out its own region of the country, or will it just start nationally?
I think it's going to have actually much more of a slow spread, and you can kind of already see it now. If you take it from the eastern and western corridor, California and the East Coast, primarily maybe New York, New Jersey, North Carolina area, you'll see a highest elements of rugby development. Obviously, from the West Coast, you see a lot of Polynesians and Oceania people coming in, and so you have that different aspect. And then from the East Coast side, through New York, you see a lot of South Africans, additional New Zealanders, English people coming through there. And what we've seen is kind of a steady spread that kind of has gone in and downward. So if you would make the argument that the West Coast, East Coast might have the strongest support systems of rugby, the Midwest probably carries the most consistent growth, and then the South has just kind of been a slow explosion upwards as we begin to address more system. Then, of course, this also kind of resonates in terms of the pathway of American football. So it's the areas where American football have the heaviest grassroots and collegiate element are the ones that have maybe the slowest growth of rugby, but have the highest ceiling for development. So I don't think it'll be as regionalized. I think lacrosse, as much as they've done amazingly in terms of their growth, I think it's because of the fact it is such an American and a Native American sport, and because it's Native American that was developed in these northeastern regions, it tends to be very regionalized and then trickled out.
All right. Now, with this development, we want to be inclusive to everyone including everyone of all genders. So can we talk about women in rugby and their growth and how rugby's trying to include them even at a young age, as we saw in the video earlier? And to me, I think that's important because if you look at the way women grow, basketball obviously creates a lot of injuries as the hips start to flare out and jumping up and down. Rugby's played on a softer surface, and I think it can use the attributes and skill set of a woman similar to soccer. So can you kind of touch on the movement of women in rugby?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I'll always say this. When it comes to women in rugby, that's actually the secret ingredient that will actually explode rugby beyond some of these big four sports, because of the fact that there is no rule change that goes between women's rugby and men's rugby. The only difference is the people that are playing on the field. But when it comes with women's rugby, it's, in my opinion, I think it might be some of the best played rugby because you get the best athletes. And reason being, there's just not an extensive amount of contact, especially team contact sports for women. You have basically hockey, which is segmented to money just because of equipment and having to use the ring. Field hockey isn't popular here in the U.S. Or you have fight sports, which has its own kind of arena, and that's an individual aspect. Outside of those, you don't have a team contact sport that matches out. And I think what we've seen is a lot of women starting to find their way in. Like some of the women I mentioned before all started from other sports like soccer. Cheta Emba was a collegiate soccer player at Harvard. Naya Tapper was a former track star at North Carolina, University of North Carolina. And you kind of see them come into rugby and just really thrive because you get to see their highest competition. And now, with New Zealand, who's bringing in their women, Fiji women continuing to rise and explode, England women continue to grow. So the competition becomes really fierce, and you start to now see more and more girls starting to want to play because it takes away the stigma of saying that if you play rugby, then it's a masculine concept or something like that. And the reality is, it's just like, no, you're kind of a badass, to be honest with you. And you gain a different level of confidence with it. I've seen it in this country and outside the country. And so the growth of women's rugby just changes the game for how we are able to affect the population, including the spectators that come into it.
Definitely. One of the things I correlate with women's rugby is the influx. If you see a lot of the countries outside of America, they'll take their sprinters that don't qualify for the Olympics and put them in other sports. You start to see them now in the Winter Olympics for bobsled. You'll see some track athletes even go to soccer even. And with America doing that, I think they can take the influx of women's basketball players, soccer players, and just people that may not have been doing anything and probably field the best rugby teams due to the differentiation where you can have small, short, you can have, defenders, you can have each position available.
Exactly. That's it in a nutshell. And again, one of the advantages of rugby is that it has there's size position for everybody. As much as people see big rugby players and in terms of their screening, the rugby player size aspects definitely vary and actually have very specific uses if need be.
Just
and
like
again,
volleyball. Yep.
Exactly. So
could you break down those positions for us real quick?
Absolutely. So we're going to take it from the position of rugby union, rugby 15s. All right. Because that has all the positions. So if you have it based off of 8 people who are what you're called your forwards, 7 people who are called your backs. Forwards are your biggest guys, your strongest guys, your power guys typically. So you start off with up front, you have 2 props. These guys are sometimes your equivalent of NFL tackles, NFL tackle guard mixes. Their jobs are to be able to clear out defenders from their players if they're getting tackled, create push to be able to return the ball, etc., like that. In between there, if you're looking at what we call a scrum, and people have seen it where the 2 sides are kind of colliding into each other, it's called a scrum. In between there, you have your hooker. Their job is to grab the ball whenever it's fed in through the scrum, get the advantage on the ball from there. Behind them are typically your tallest guys. They're called locks. The locks are there so that they can, one, create additional push in the scrum. Their job is to, what we have is called a line out, which basically is like a jump ball off of the out of bounds zone. They usually are used as lifters or to be lifted to get the highest point in the ball. And of course, are just great for creating short bursts, particularly just because of the length of their legs and their size, making them more difficult to tackle. From that side, you have on each side of the locks, and then behind them, you have what's called flankers. Now, flankers are probably your most agile, most mobile, and most versatile players. I say this also as a former flanker, so I might be a little biased. But you have your flankers who their jobs are basically to be the middle ground between the backs and the forward. They need to clear out like the forwards. They need to create tackles like the forwards, but they also need to be in position to be able to receive the ball like a back. They need to be able to direct the traffic a little bit whenever the lines are being set, whether on offense or on defense. And then, of course, behind them is the 8-man, who definitely is just like a clear-out person. They're another form of a flanker. They're typically just bigger, and they're almost like another secret weapon. Think of them like a tight end in essence. They kind of work to be a little George Kittle out there for people. From that point, you have your scrum half, whose job is to take the ball from the inside the scrum, inside the rucks, and distribute it out. Get it out to the backs, get it out to the other players, and just make sure they're low-key your quarterback. I'll say quarterback half because the next player up is called the fly half. They wear typically number 10. They are the beginning of the backs, the speedy guys. They are considered the quarterbacks of the back. So their job is to distribute amongst their speediest players. Whoever they need to get to, it's their job to set it all up. What you have after that is called centers. You have your inside center and your outside center. These guys are your bigger, speedy guys. Again, some people like to reference them close to safeties. I like to look at them as running backs, safety and running backs for your players. And, as safety and running backs do, they're your safety option. They run the ball down your throat, and their job is just to create havoc. And then to your outside, you have your wings, fastest guys on the field, typically are just there to score, close the ball out, get it out the edge, and they're usually the stars. They don't really do much often, but they're there to close out or slow down tacklers and just get it out. And then lastly, in the back is your fullback, your number 15. They are the overseers of the entire backfield. They typically are kicking the ball. They are the last line of defense against an opponent from the score. They are usually commanding the defense in some way, shape, or form to be able to make sure that everything is cleared out and good to go.
Now, when we talk about all those positions, again, using soccer as a reference and even basketball, how those sports have changed, where you look at basketball, traditionally you had a center that just ran and stood under the basket. Now you have centers shooting threes. If you look at soccer, you have right and left backs playing box to box, trying to score. What innovations can rugby do with those positions to make the game more exciting, more offensive?
So I think it's already been doing that. So obviously the interesting thing with rugby is, despite all the positions and what I said that they do, the thing is everybody has the same equivalent job. It's, can you catch the ball? Can you run with the ball? Can you tackle? And doesn't matter who you are, you can all do that. Before, it used to be a little bit more segmented, that backs are going to run, forwards are going to, power and tackle and lead the way. But what we're seeing more and more now, especially as the game has gotten speedier and guys have gotten bigger and faster, is that even your forwards are becoming more integral parts of your offense. The backs and wings are becoming more integral parts of the defense. They have to be more effective in these elements and these lineouts and these lines, so that there is greater equitability in how you can set up your play, because rugby is a chess match in a lot of senses, because of the fact that you have to make the play on the field. You don't get a preset play like you might with football, but you, similarly to kind of how you have with basketball, you might have an idea of where you're starting with, but you have to manipulate it to get to where you want to end. And the best players and the best teams really end up learning how to manipulate it where everybody is a function of both the score and the defense. So I think it's not so much what do we need to, as much as it's continuing to develop into that way.
Okay, thank you. Now, when we talk about representation and again coverage, I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up the GiftTime Rugby Network. Can you please talk about your network and what your aim is and the type of coverage you have? Everyone, please follow the GiftTime Rugby Network, by the way.
Thank you so much. So look, the GiftTime Rugby Network was something that I started initially as a pet project. So when I was playing rugby, one thing that I had always asked a question is, I don't get why rugby isn't bigger right now. It doesn't make sense, because it has all the aspects. It has a community, it has a connection, mobility, yada, 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 what you need. And so I kind of realized that, and this was around 2012, 2013. When I was playing, we kind of had a down year, and I got to know the teams around me that were outside of what I was playing. And I realized that there wasn't much coverage, especially in the South. And so I was like, you know what? Let me go ahead and cover the South. I'm going to start making predictions for the rugby in the South and start talking about our club teams, so that people have an anticipation. Because if you don't know what's happening, you can't know what's going to happen, what's going on. Obviously, you don't know what you don't know. So I started creating that. And what actually it built towards was, I realized, people want to see the game. So I started filming the games. And from that, I was like, people want to hear it live. I started doing live recordings. At this time, I was using through Spreaker. I used to do live podcasts of games and just working as being an announcer and calling these games. And then I'll film the games and then mesh them together and put them online. And I was like, there's got to be more, because people want to see the games live and you want to hear the game. And, the growth goes. But I was like, okay, can I stream? And I honestly didn't know if I could. This is 2014 at this point. Streaming wasn't really popping like that yet. We'd seen early stages, but it hadn't gone so far. And a former colleague of mine wanted to ask me about filming and wondered if I could stream for this all-star team that was going on in Atlanta. And I was like, sure, I can try. Let's see what we can do. First time, utterly failed at it. Utterly just misunderstood what everything was going on. But and I almost was going to give it up, but he asked me again, and I was like, okay, let me understand. And when I started streaming, it kind of changed the way that I looked at everything. And it became like, how can we create a regular broadcast of games that are happening? Where can we start from? And so I knew club games have their aspects, but the American public, we work in we want to see what's happening next, not who could we be. And a lot of times when it comes to guys that are older playing club, it's guys who aren't going to be playing. Well, not going to be playing, because a lot of athletes play. But if it's not professional, we tend to disregard it. So yeah. I looked at the college level a lot more. And from looking at the college level, I just kind of worked the South itself and just wanted to create the regularity of it. But the other half of it was, I wanted to create an element where we could start bringing in people from the outside to attach themselves to rugby. So I, started hiring camera operators, and being able to say like, hey, everybody talks about they can go commentate on games. All right, here, I'll give you a platform. Go commentate on this game. You can do it on my network. I'll do the marketing. I know how to direct this. I don't need to hear myself all the time. Let me bring more people on. Let me bring more camera people on. And in that way, I felt was a way that people could be now introduced to the game without having to feel like the only way they could do it is by playing. Because we know 90% of fans do not play their sport. And rugby has a unique nature that, club sports, older people play. But, most people who are going to come in are going to be side aspects. And in doing so, it also creates the ecosystem. And I wanted to continue to create that ecosystem of rugby. So we bring in the camera operators, we bring in the announcers, we bring in now directors. Now we can start actually having people do analysis on the games afterwards, because now we're getting footage of this games. And now we're getting to see more and more regularity in terms of people getting talked about, because now the players, we get to know names, we get to have the rosters, they're in permanent places. People get to see actually the duration of their career grow. And it kind of started to build up from 2014 to the current. And really, 2014 to 2018, I think, saw its greatest growth. And that was that edge. So GiftTime Rugby Network wanted to be a part and kind of help develop in that, especially here in the South. And it created a lot of my connections within it, because
exactly. Now, when we talk about GiftTime Rugby Network and all the growth you did and expanding the game, you have to talk about this Grow Rugby show.
Yo, Grow Rugby is another one that it was kind of something I started early, way in 2014, and then I stopped it. So initially when I did Grow Rugby, again, from Louisiana, like I was born in State College, raised a little bit in Iowa, but I claim Louisiana because I've been there for 22 years. But Louisiana, I wanted to be able to, again, show what rugby was in the South. And initially it was just doing news reports. So I'd go to places, run clips, run the highlights of games that I did, run the highlights of everybody's stuff. And it was great for a little bit, but when I started streaming, it became a little bit more difficult. So when I brought it back, brought it back as a podcast. And instead, I wanted to really highlight Black and brown voices, particularly in rugby, because of the fact that we're still in this apex point where, you see there's more Black players than there was even when I started playing. But, we still weren't hearing about so much of the up-and-comers, or not even just the up-and-comers. We weren't hearing about the people who were elite. Like, we started getting little bits of people, like we have our I think she's the GOAT, Hall of Famer, Phaedra Knight. She's a World Rugby Hall of Famer. She's an HBCU alumni and just dope person, just lawyer, businesswoman, everything. So it was basically her. She was almost like our I don't want to say MLK, our George Washington Carver kind of situation. Like, you just hear Phaedra. But you didn't hear much about anybody else. So I was like, all right, let me go ahead. And luckily, the rugby world, and having done a lot of work, is a really grounded and grassrooted. And I started talking to these people. Got to talk to these guys like Ram Eddings, who ran the Grey Wolves back in the 90s. First all-Black touring rugby squad in the U.S. Got to talk to
good documentary, Gift.
Yo, I'm telling you, like, it became this access point into a different set of history and getting to know people. For me, it was, I just got to know people and got to know more rugby people than what was directly in front of me. But what it ends up really being is like kind of a documentation of what people are doing and getting an actual stance for people who don't get talked about until you show them. And then people are like, oh, I remember. And then I started using it to access people overseas, because it's like, it's not just the US, but this is the same issue happening in the Caribbean, happening in Asia, happening in the African continent, and happening in South America. And it was just like, yo, you get to now talk to these people in Canada, got to talk in the Philippines, in Brazil here, in over in Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica. And you just kind of realize the heftiness and the breadth of this rugby network and this fraternal nature where everybody kind of understands the problems, but they have the same love and they have the same
goals.
Goals, exactly. And you realize, yo, we're really all facing the same thing. And that's significant whenever you're saying you have a world element that's growing this game together. So now there's not a factor of, okay, yes, there's better teams in this, but we can all get up to this level. Like, the difference isn't that significant. It's time and money. So if we're all doing this, let's go do this together. And it just opens up the world into a different way. And I love it.
Now, when you talk about that community, that growth, that everyone wanting to come together and to see this game grow, can you talk about how those feelings embarked on you creating this HBCU Rugby Classic and Music Festival that's growing year by year?
Absolutely. So the HBCU Rugby Classic it kind of came together when I found out that HBCUs had rugby back in 2015. And I went to Atlanta and saw Morehouse had it. And I had learned that Florida A&M at the time had it. They don't have it right now. They need to come back. But I was like, there's HBCUs that have it. Literally a year later, 2016, found out that Prairie View A&M in Houston had rugby as well, too. They'd had it for about 3 years. Morehouse had it for 4 years. When I met them, was 3 years at that point as well, too. And I was like, we need to be able to get this. And also during that time, how I said with the GiftTime Rugby Network, I wanted to bring other people in. I started wanting to create halftime shows for these rugby games because, there needs to be aspects that brings people in who don't know the sport but have a connection to it. And so I've been running it in Atlanta, and I'd run it in Austin, Texas, and I'd run one in Mobile, Alabama. And it wasn't coming quite right. And I was like, I can do something with this, with the HBCUs, because in my belief, not only are HBCUs a requirement that they need to be part of rugby, but they are literally the foundation, in my opinion, a foundation of legitimate American culture, in the sense that it was born in America, it was created in America, it was created by people who built America. And hence, if you want to create American cultural rugby, you need to involve them directly as a part of it. It is not a borrow from all these other people. They are a complete aspect of what you want to do. And we see this with football and literally any other of our major sports. But I also wanted an aspect where these HBCUs were going to be able to take advantage of bringing in an influx of international rugby players who want to come to the States and want to be a part of it. And I know a lot of people have an aspect of wanting to kind of segment away non-Black people from it. But I also am a big believer that Black foundational cultural elements need to absorb other people's elements.
Broadcast and talk, yeah.
Exactly. Like, this is a foundation too. It's not, this is Black college and this is other. No, this is an American college that has a foundation in Black culture. You can be able to absorb yourself into the Black culture without being able to be.
Now, one of the things I like about that gift is I go a step further, and I always use the word African culture. So being a historian and even going through history, I like to show people and point out the different things, like pizza, for instance, is an African food. If you look at okra in West Africa is king gumbo, and gumbo is one of the main components. So if we are able to teach other cultures like they do us, that this is their culture, this is their food, then we can not only market it, but sell it, because everyone sells their own culture.
Exactly. And it can be claimed ownership without having to lose that dilution or exactly. That happens so often. Exactly. That was my thought exactly. So I was like, how can we can bring this together? The elements are already there. And then it just happened to be that Morehouse and Prairie View A&M are relatively about the same distance away from Baton Rouge. I guess Morehouse is a little bit further, 7 hours versus 4. But they're distant. The middle ground is basically about the same area. So coming to Baton Rouge was a natural spot for it. And it was something that had been just in my mind. It took me 3 years to really get to it. But, I was so happy. And I'm not going to lie. It was probably the first time was probably one of the hardest things I've ever done, because while as much as it was something that people looked at or thought was a nice idea, I got so much pushback because it was such a new concept. And it's kind of wild now because we're seeing so many HBCU rugby programs grow since 2018. But it was just, I don't know why it never was something that got pushed up more beforehand. But I think it's just because people didn't know. I legitimately doing the HBCU Rugby Classic. I always thought HBCUs were a normal thing because Baton Rouge has Southern University. We got Grambling up north. My dad used to go to Alabama A&M. So I'm so used to being in the HBCU arena that I didn't know that people legitimately didn't even know what an HBCU was. Both African diaspora and non-African diaspora people did not know what an HBCU was. And so in doing it was a lesson in and of itself. And then you have to kind of break down exactly why these things existed, and on top of that they're not it's not Black only, it is predominantly Black and it's Black created. So you have to have a different mindset in saying, no, you have to respect it of its own terms and enter into it, not try and amalgamate it into what you already have. So it created just a whole new era, but of understanding for people, especially in the rugby community. And all of a sudden kind of see this rise of people wanting to be a part of this thing, and we want to create it so fast. So with the HBCU Rugby Classic, it was creating the music and bringing people in that understand pop culture, but it also works in conjunction with African culture. It's creating an element that sets a foundation for everything else.
Now, thank you so much for your great response. Now, we all know about the college club teams that participate, but could you tell us about the high schools and the youth teams that you bring in as well to make this a mix of rugby on all levels, so you can see foundational beginnings all the way up to college club teams and have professionals there to sign autographs and maybe do some skills, who knows, in the future?
All of that is already in existence, and it's one of the things that I love the most is being able to see these high schoolers, because again, in the aspect we have to, I love my rugby people, but I think there's a lot of times that when it comes to adding Black players into rugby, it sometimes gets very simplified into, we can get faster, stronger, bigger, we're just getting more athletes, and it starts to kind of strip away some of the humanity that's there. And so with the Classic, I've always been a big believer of, I want to protect and make sure that whenever you're seeing the kid or you're seeing a player, you're seeing the player and not just the talent that they have as well. And when you get these high schoolers, you get to see just what opportunities grow just from being able to get streamed on it, being able to get talked about individually. There's guys who they played, I talk about programs like Memphis Inner City Rugby, which is a premium program that's been growing since 2012, have developed amazing players, amazing leaders in the community, and is just a wonder of a creation. I have nothing but love for them. Dallas.
Now, the one thing about that Memphis team is they have a lot of people on that team that if it wasn't for that team, they might not still be with us.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so important, is that it changes how people run their culture. And that's what I was saying this earlier. One of the aspects of rugby is the fact that you can be outside of just your region, your state, your country. There's literally the sky is your limit. The sky is literally your limit. And with these youth programs, these kids get to see that there is so much more. It is the most beautiful thing, and bringing them in and get to see them talk with the college players and get the aspect, and the older players work with the younger players and get to talk. And it just creates a belief in a sense of wonder and aspiration that, it's hard, even if you have your whole team that's Black and feeling like you're the only one that's playing and you feel isolated, then you enter into this arena where you see other people who look like you, the refs look like you, the business owners look like you, the players look like you, everybody's playing high level. Like it's a different world and a different connection, and that network changes the game, and bringing them in has always been probably one of my best decisions ever. Now I will fight day and night to have them.
I agree. Now, outside of that, you've also brought in a lot of poets, rappers, singers, dancers, and performers that have used this festival to try to launch their music and entertainment careers. Can you speak on that as well?
Look, as anything goes, it's a platform and this is a community. And I wanted to make sure that it's not just, again, I want to help create the rugby ecosystem. that includes bringing in people who represent the culture, and that's including our speakers. You know, the mayor of Baton Rouge had been to ours 3 times, 3 times to our event, 2 times to our event. I'm sorry. And having her there creates a credibility. When we've had our hip hop artists, our poets, these are people that I literally just got to scout and got to enjoy and watch, and I love what they do. And they're great at what they do. And being able to give them a platform and be able to help be part of their career and their growth, and having them be able to see this aspect where rugby seems such like a unique element. And for me, I'm just like, yo, not only could you use this here, no, there are so many other, there's thousands of teams across the world that you could use as tour bases to be able to perform and spread your mission, spread your art into all these places that are not just how do I get into the Super Bowl, or how do I get into an NBA game? How do I get into the college championships and perform in these aspects? It's like, yo, you can work a platform that's not just the small club over here. You have just a different element. And so it was to be able to grow, and I hope to be able to continue to do that aspect more and more each time, and growing these different elements.
Now, when you speak of that, can you also go towards what do you see your ultimate goal is for rugby growth in this country, and in particular in the diaspora in this country?
You know, I've said it once and I'll say it again. This is all about creating the rugby ecosystem. I think the gameplay is great. Gameplay is great, and I want more people to be able to play the game. But what I really want is the rugby culture to be able to get developed even more and more. And that aspect of rugby is the one that keeps me in it the most. And for me, it's like over these next years, I want to be able to see more Black and just African diaspora people coming into the game. I remember when I went to the Rugby World Cup in 2019, and while there were African people who were working for other companies, I was pretty much the only independent media person for the Rugby World Cup. Something that happens every 4 years, receives millions of visitors and views every year, every 4 years. And I was the only one of 2 independent Black media people. I want to see more of us. I want to see more of us as announcers. I want to see more people doing analysis off camera. We're starting to see a little bit. Guys like my boy Lance Richard, freelance. I mean, he'll know himself. But like, you know, you get people like the Granbys who create these teams, and not only create teams, but they're creating education systems with Roots Rugby. And you just see these people develop their own aspects and create their own independent cultures of rugby, connected into rugby, still maintain the authenticity of themselves, and it gives people a chance to grow out into these different regions. And I'm just continuing to hope that we're seeing more merch developers. I want to see more. When I say analysts, don't mean just people who talk about rugby. I want data analysts. I want more videographers, more highlights people. Like, there's a whole business element of rugby that has not been tapped in because there was so much hesitance to the idea of making money in rugby. And now I think that we can do it, and do it something that we couldn't do with American football because we came in too late. Couldn't do it with soccer. And the same aspect because Europe is just so crouched down into it. You know, we haven't been able to we're trying with basketball, but it's ownership. Ownership is the name of the game. And I think rugby has a place to do it, and that ecosystem can grow within our African.
And that's exactly where I was going. So do you think systems things put in place like your festival that are contributing to this rugby ecosystem can catch the eye of maybe a basketball, football player, and they'll be starting to own these teams again. So that way you'll see that vertical integration from the bottom up. Can you kind of see that, or you have any plans to market to professional athletes to become similar again to what soccer is doing? LeBron James owns a portion of a Premier League team, a few others. Do you see yourself and others marketing to these athletes? Hey, let's get into ownership in this up and coming sport.
100%. We actually kind of already see it now with in the U.S. we have at least a professional rugby league called Major League Rugby, and I forgot the name of the New England player that has a partial ownership of the New England Free Jacks that's based off in Boston area. but it's still the early element. And I don't even think that people need to be limited to a league in rugby, which is kind of a unique aspect. When you have touring teams, and again, when you have thousands and thousands and thousands of teams in almost every single country in the world, you have tournaments in majority of the countries around the world, you can take a team and be able to use that as your own marketing tool, or use it as your a means of being able to create professionalism without having to be limited into an international aspect, or an international league aspect, or even a professional league, and still be professional, still be able to carry a momentum and play all these kind of big time players. I think it legitimately is capable here, but I think people are still, again, learning about rugby. And this is where people like myself, as you had my homie Kirill Guthrie and the Granbys, and all these guys outside of the rugby, just in all these aspects, they are creating the information that puts it out there to allow these unknowns to be able to enter in. And we're seeing the investments. Like right now, American investors have already put into the New Zealand All Blacks. They own 60% of the 40% of the New Zealand All Blacks. They own the United Football League, United Rugby League championships in France. Like, it's starting to go there. We don't need to be behind on that. It is something that we can legitimately do. We can legitimately organize. Everything is still in this slightly Wild West aspect. And it's a time. It's like goldmine. This is Apple in the 90s. This is Google in 98. Like, you need to jump in on this while it's there. And you're going to see much more higher growth, in my belief.
Now, speaking of this growth, how do you see this growth representing the United States national team with individuals from the African diaspora?
Look, we have seen more and more people being able to be part of it. Like, I talk about one of my friends, his name is Akinola Raymond. This guy is a Nigerian guy. He's been playing since he was in middle school, and he's finally getting a chance to be able to play at the elite squad. He's 24 years old, play at the USA rugby level. We have been seeing a steady growth of our improvement because we have younger and younger players going into it each time. Now that we have all these programs that are allowing more Black youth to be attracted into the programs, we're going to only keep seeing it grow more and more because of the fact that we're now no longer ignorance is not a barrier. We still have one aspect that's going to hurt us, and it's our pay to play model that I know it works in the concept of like with basketball, the youth basketball league. I forgot the name. AAU, thank you. And we see it with a little bit with the camps with football. We're looking to find an aspect that's in the middle, but you need those support systems to be able to help bring some kids who just can't pay $150, $200, $300 to come play. With guys like Carlin Isle here, and I know you brought him up here, but guys like Carlin Isle who came late, and for him, his story, an orphan to playing football at Temecula State, and to find his way onto the rugby team because just needed another opportunity. And then now, international superstar. Perry Baker, guy who started playing in high school and early college, played a little bit of semi-pro, found his way back to rugby, and international superstar.
So how do we produce more Carlin Isles and Perry Bakers in our community?
To be honest with you, I don't think we produce more of them. I think we actually start to produce better versions of them.
Okay.
They're phase one. They've been phase one, and I think we're starting to see it. But it starts with being able to develop the grassroots, supporting the upward mobility concept for players. Can we get more support for HBCU rugby programs so that these HBCUs can help, or not even the HBCUs can help, but so we can create scholarship programs for these rugby programs so kids can be able to come participate and develop their academics and be able to use that to get to another level where we can get them to the pros, or we can get them to be in more professional elements of rugby and develop that aspirable direction where people will continue to drop themselves in. And of course, the passion of the game goes in first and foremost overall, because if you're not loving the game, it's really hard to play the game.
Now, speaking of passion and phase one, and in particular Carlin Isles, we're going to show a quick video on him, but just to give you a synopsis, Carlin Owls, he played American football, like a Division III school, found his way into rugby, and went from literally rags to riches. Now as an international star, as Gift just said. And before that, like I said, playing Division III football, working regular jobs. So that goes to show you just like how people go from track to pushers in the Olympics for bobsled and other different sports. We can do this too and transition within our community. If you play defensive back and you run a 4.6 and you don't get cut by the NFL, go play soccer or play rugby. Get picked up for someone. So just to show you how everything correlates, we're going to show a quick video on Carlin Owls. Now just think of it playing, this is backyard football on Saturday or anytime in the summer, no equipment, and watch how Carlin Owls operates. And when you watch this video, everyone's going to say, I know 10 people like that in my neighborhood growing up that play like Carlin Owls or better. So real quick, we're going to get on Carlin Owls, and then we'll get back to our special guest, Gift. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Jamar Harp. This is Sports 101. All right, so right there you saw a video of Carlin Owls. Again, a lot of things in that video may have been missed, but I just want to point out it's very rare in rugby that you see someone make a tackle, get back up, catch the ball, and score in the same sequence. That shows the versatility of Carlin Owls. Can you give some more insight on him, Gift, please?
Yeah, man. Carlin is a guy, really nice guy. I've met him a couple times, but he's a guy that's really kind of grown with the sport. You know, before he was really just kind of known as the speed guy, wasn't a great defense guy, but, you know, he decided to really dedicate himself in, and you just saw his development over time, and he's now one of the elite players. So it's dangerous to have a guy who's speedy, and then now he can tackle, so you can't really even get away from him. And whenever you go play against these Fijians, especially in sevens, believe me, you need the combo. You need the combo over there.
Now, speaking of the combo, we already talked about poaching from other sports. I'd like to bring up someone that me and Gift spoke about that we didn't realize we knew together. This is Freddie Henry Ajudua. So I know Freddie and his family, they live in Durham, North Carolina, from Nigeria as well, attended North Carolina Central University, my alma mater. And the story is when I was coaching there in 2011 and 12. Freddie had just came out of high school. He was a kicker, Hillside High, very inconsistent, wanted to walk on at kicker, but he would kick the ball out of bounds. And, on kickoff, that's not good in college. So he walked on and he moved to linebacker. And all of a sudden he had this super growth spurt. He had a serum or something. He turned into a 260-pound defensive end, made great plays in the Celebration Bowl against Grambling State, which was a 10-9 loss. I had a couple sacks, signed as a free agent in the NFL. Remember, he was a kicker in high school. He walked on to play Division I football, signed in the NFL, got cut, then transitioned to rugby. So he plays professionally in Atlanta, and he also is a member of the Nigerian rugby team. So can you kind of give your insights on Freddie and the things that he's done in his transition from American football to rugby?
Man, when you talk about a guy that's had a journey, I like I told you, I talked to him for the Grow Rugby show last year, and it was spurned because of his being a part of the Nigerian rugby national team, before it kind of got messed up right before World Rugby Cup qualifiers. But, he's got probably one of the most interesting stories because of the fact that his direction went through like just elite talent. So he went to Life University, where it's probably some of the best rugby that's played in the country right now. And, that's where his connection was to Atlanta. Actually, his former coach actually was the former head coach for Atlanta at the time. And even whenever he stepped away from Atlanta United, Rugby Atlanta, he kind of found his way traversing through with some of these other teams. Worked with Hartford Harpooners, did some stuff with, I want to say Tiger Rugby, or I think definitely did some stuff with Roots. But, anywhere you talk to anybody about it, he is a beast on the field, an absolute beast on the field. And from, I think, what he wasn't able to do with the Jaguars and what he was able to do at NCC, I think he's able to multiply way more in rugby because of the fact that he stands out as a talent. I mean, he's a talent wherever he goes, but he stands out as a talent and is able to just change the game. I'm can't wait to be able to put together an HBCU alumni all-star team just to be able to have him come on. I wanted to do one for the Classic, but we ended up not being able to do it. But he was like, hey, if you do one, call me. Let me know.
Okay. So now, in closing, could you tell us about this year's HBCU Rugby and Music Festival? What can we expect? And, just share your passion for this year's festival.
Yeah, look, this one is going to be an interesting year. We had a lot of people being able to come through. Of course, we're trying to bring back in the rematch of Prairie View A&M versus Morehouse. Like, they are the ultimate rivalry that we have right now. Each one had won a game by large margins, the first two. And then now, unfortunately, COVID prevented Morehouse from coming from 2020 for 2021. And of 2020, obviously, we didn't have it because of COVID. And then we've been able to add now the high school sides coming in. Dallas Youth Rugby is our incumbent. Memphis Inner City Rugby has been a powerhouse. We're trying to now bring in these other programs from Connecticut, from Pennsylvania, from Philadelphia, from other Dallas areas, Kentucky, and just bring them in and really create the competition, overwhelming competition that deals up. So we're looking to have fun with that. And then, of course, what I consider the pride and joy, and this is all both boys and girls, men and women. Everything is equitable on both sides because I'd like to highlight all sides of it. We're continuing our second era of the international club element, where we represent Roots Rugby versus an international team. This year, we're looking to have Jamaica Rugby. We might have to end up changing that up. COVID's creating a little bit of issues. But, we're going to see. And then, of course, we want to, from the college side, Howard University coming through, as you guys saw, Howard women, Howard men as well, and bring them in best that we can.
Okay, so please, after we end the show, I want to stay backstage. I wanted to finish our little conversation, but can you just give everyone, let them know where they can find you, when to come to the festival, how to, just keep up with rugby. I encourage everyone to bring their daughters. It's going to be dancing. There might be dance teams in the future, cooking contests. Who knows at this rugby festival? Because, again, it's just celebrating foundational culture in America, which has to be of African descent. And we should be proud to do that. And even though that foundation was forced, it was still done by our hands and our hands of our ancestors. We must embrace that in all elements, including sport and rugby. So could you just give a few words on that, please?
Yeah, so you guys can always find information about the HBCU Rugby Classic at hbcurugbyclassic.com. You can find us on all social medias. It's HBCU Rugby Classic on Instagram and Facebook. HBCU Rugby Classic with it's CLSSC instead of Classic because Twitter didn't want me to put the full Classic on there. I don't know. But you can find I'm sorry, CLASSC, no I in there, on Twitter, and it gives you guys all the information that's going on, what's coming up this year, what we have, all the teams that are HBCUs that are existing right now, and any changes or to the schedule or anything that occurs throughout the way. So one way or another, you guys are in the know.
Thank you. So in closing of this great conversation, I'd like to give a few closing points. So again, similar to soccer and other sports in this country, the presence of rugby can change nationally as well as internationally with a diaspora participating, and that's the African diaspora. We need to focus on outreach and opportunity and also gain more participation, not only of men and women, but boys and girls. Please remember with Title IX, HBCU should consider adding women's rugby along with men's soccer to increase our participation in these two sports. I've actually spoken with, and I would encourage you to speak to him too, Gift, Mr. Raynard Dito. He just became the athletic director at Alcorn State University in Mississippi. And I specifically spoke with him about adding men's soccer. But his sentiment was you can't do that without adding a women's sport. So I suggested cycling, but I think women's rugby would be a better alternative. So everyone, please get behind that, especially at our HBCUs. I would love to see men's and women's soccer as well as women's rugby for right now. Again, thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of Sports 101. I'm your host, Jamar Harp. Thank you for our special invited guest, Gift Egbelu. You can tune in and catch me on Twitter at Coach_Harp412 and Facebook under Jamar Harp. Please get social with Sports 101, Sports Zone Chicago, and the litany of shows on Sports Zone Chicago by following Sports Zone Chicago on social media. Sports Zone Chicago can be found on Twitter at Sports Zone CHI, Facebook at Sports Zone Chicago, and Instagram at Sports Zone Chicago. Subscribe to the YouTube channel, search Sports Zone Chicago, but more importantly, download the Sports Zone Chicago app. The Sports Zone Chicago app can be found on the iTunes, Google Play, and Amazon stores. Again, this was one of my best episodes with Gift Egbelu. I plan on doing a lot of more business with him. Hopefully, we can combine soccer and rugby together and get this diaspora going. But please tune in next week. We'll have another great show next Wednesday, 8 p.m. Central, 9 p.m. Eastern. Again, thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of Sports 101. I am Jamar Harp, and I will see you next week. Thank you for tuning in.